Hey everybody, it's Tom, and I wanted to come to you today to follow up with some remarks upon Marxism in light of the two previous videos, one where I simply alluded to making such remarks, and the other about existentialism and the value of existentialism as a tradition at our current place in time in history. Marxism is another tradition of thought, which develops actually in some respects almost in parallel with existentialism, and in fact, there's a lot of interface between those traditions, with many major existentialists expositing Marxism as something to which they were committed in various ways. But they are distinct. Marxism, as a rule, has its eyes focused upon what could be sort of said to be the social level of happenings. And so the fundamental lens it applies to history is a lens which thinks in terms of class and class conflict, of social relations. And this is really the genius of Karl Marx's particular interpretation of capitalism, an interpretation which takes the efforts of his immediate predecessors, Adam Smith and David Ricardo most notably, and radicalizes what is being set forth in classical economics through the insight of what is sometimes referred to as the fetishism of the commodity. What is that insight? It's the insight that these forces that we deem economic, these actions of commodity and commerce, have the appearance of a kind of autonomy, the interaction of supply and demand coming together to determine prices, which in turn affect how we relate with these objects. There is this impression of an autonomy to that universe that is reflected in the language we use, the language of the laws and tendencies and so forth, and the kind of power which we give to such indexes as, at our own point in time, things like the Dow, the stock market, the GDP, etc., etc. And indeed, these things do have a reality to them. It would be sort of fatuous to suggest that they don't have a reality or a kind of force. But it is not ultimate reality. It is a concealing reality. Because behind the mechanisms of the economy is a fundament of social relationships that are concealed by the impression of market force. Probably the most significant of these social relations, well, ultimately the most significant of these social relations is the class relationship, whereby one segment of society is capable of dominating and controlling the resources of that society to their overwhelming benefit and to the detriment of most others. Of course, that's not just something which happens under capitalism. That happens and has happened historically within every class society. Capitalism is somewhat unique in that the terms of the equation give the impression to a kind of autonomy, kind of justification for that state of affairs, which was absent from other intervals, or that the justification which it provides is different in that it doesn't necessarily posit a metaphysical distinction between different parts of the human society. Class isn't framed in explicitly biological or in religious ways. It rather comes down to a question of property. And property is really an index of power. Now let's be clear that they're not identical, but they track each other closely. So we look at the commodity relationship, which comes into sharpest relief over the question of wage. I'm going to run a really fast syllogism here because, we've got to work within a 10-minute window. And the syllogism goes like this. A commodity's cost is that which is required for its production and reproduction. Labor power is a commodity. Therefore, the cost of labor power, that is the wage, is what is necessary to reproduce it, i.e., what it takes to bring the worker back to work the next day. And that is all to which the worker, as a vendor of the commodity of labor power, or labor time, rather, to be more precise, is entitled in virtue of the relationship of labor exchange. And so what you actually see is an insulation of the laborer from participation in the fruits of their own efforts by dint of the fact that their access to just basic survival is predicated upon selling themselves, or really, to be more precise, renting themselves. And who is it that is in a position to pay that rent? Namely, it is those who own, to use the classical language, the means of production, and are capable of leveraging that ownership to exploit everybody else. Those people fall under the rubric of the bourgeoisie as opposed to the proletariat. Now, that is very broad. Those are some very broad brushstrokes, and I'm not going to pretend there's all sorts of qualifications that need to be inserted to nuance and build upon that analysis. But I think, is fair to say that it is a fundamental insight of Marxism, the nature of this class relationship, and how the economy and the language of economy and commodity sort of powerfully masks the situation of power in the scenario, the situation of a radical maldistribution of power. There is, in turn, an obvious tension between what happens in virtue of this situation where wage labor is so significant, and the ideals of democracy, which call for a radical equality through society all in all. That notwithstanding, it became apparent that merely political reform was necessary but insufficient to realize that equality, and the effort to move beyond a merely formal or political reform to a more genuinely just universe is to what the socialists of the 19th century, of which Marx is probably the most significant, that's to what they were actually marching. And that's what Marxism is really about, moving to a world of greater equality, where economic consideration no longer dominates and deforms how we interact with each other. So I have found this accounting decidedly persuasive. And thus, here I am talking about Marxism as something to which we should pay heed here in the early 21st century. So much by way of summary remarks. Now, some people want to suggest that there's a tension between existentialism and Marxism, and that tension may even be a fatal one. We're trying to do a follow-up and address that. But before turning to that affair, I just wanted to put this out there by way of setting tone. All right, guys, it's been Tom. Thanks for listening. That's all for now, and I'll catch you on the flip.